Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Electric Uncut, the video series where I talk about whatever I want to talk about. And today's subject is very timely and relevant, I think, which is the MiSTer FPGA project. This thing has been gaining steam, it's been gaining popularity, more people are talking about it, more people are asking about it, more controversy is being sparked, and of course, larger gaming YouTubers are now making videos and content around it. And so I thought, I better get in while the getting is good before these guys show up and completely crush me under their boot. And so now is the time to make this video. And what I'm going to be doing is trying my best to give an analysis of what the MiSTer is, where its strengths are, what its disadvantages are, what demographics of people are going to be into it, where you may not be into it, because I do think it has a certain appeal. It is not an off-the-shelf product. It's not something like the SNES Mini or the Sega Genesis Mini where you just buy it at the mall, take it home and plug it in. No, this is much more of an enthusiast project, but I think the potential for this thing is absolutely enormous, and I do think it's going to catch on more and more as we move into the future. With that being said though, I also want to try my best to be objective, fair, balanced, all that good stuff, because one thing I've noticed in the world of retro gaming, especially when it comes to emulation for some reason, is that people can get real religious about this stuff, where if they really like something, they're going to develop a tunnel vision. They're not going to want to hear criticism. They're not going to want to hear the advantages of other alternatives or other products. They have found their one true God, and if you cross them, you will pay. I remember running into that when I was covering Shmup Arch and Retro Arch. I still run into it from time to time, and trying to explain why in certain situations it may be the better way to go rather than using MAME. I remember the MAME Illuminati were not happy with that whatsoever. I remember getting really trashed a lot back in the day over this, and I remember some of my favorite comments were like I was defiling the genre with Retro Arch, and it's pretty funny how far people took it, to be honest. I've learned my lesson. I shall not speak ill of the one true MAME, the goddess that gives us air to breathe and mana to eat. But anyway, so what I want to do in this video is, while I am a fan of the MiSTer, I don't want to tunnel vision in and totally disregard some of its disadvantages where they do exist. And I don't want to completely mull that over and just tell you buy now, because it may not be the right fit. And I also want to try my best, if I can, to present some alternatives, because I do like to think of myself as a fairly balanced guy when it comes to these different things, where what I'm looking for are certain features and just outright performance. Those are the things that really attract me. And just because the nature of emulation, there really is no one-size-fits-all solution, at least right now. And so if you're looking for particular features, you may have to turn to software emulation. If you're looking for other features or other appeal, then maybe this MiSTer is the way to go. So with all this being said, let's begin, or try to begin, by explaining what the hell this thing is. And I have to say, this has been a real challenging video to make, because explaining what the MiSTer is turns out to be a pretty technical and ridiculous prospect. So let us take this a step at a time. So the MiSTer is an FPGA, open source, hardware-based emulation project. Did we get all that? So let's begin with open source. That's a little bit more simple. Open source means that it is freely accessible to the public to join in on and to create things for, and to download code from. People who create cores for the MiSTer, for example, aren't going to sell you the core. You don't have to buy the core to play Dononpachi. You don't have to buy the core to play the Super Nintendo. The only thing you need to buy is the hardware itself. And this is not proprietary hardware. I think people were getting confused by that as well when I was talking about the Dononpachi core. People were thinking, oh, what is this maybe they thought it was a company. What is this FPGA company? You know, they're totally exploiting Dononpachi and shmups and that sort of thing. And I was explaining, no, this hardware actually isn't even necessarily for gaming. FPGA, which stands for Field Programmable Gate Array, has tons of other uses outside of gaming. It's just it's being repurposed for gaming usage. Very similar to something like a Raspberry Pi, right? Like when Raspberry Pi was being developed, I'm not sure if the people developing were thinking, okay, yeah, this is going to be badass for emulating Super Nintendo and that sort of thing. They were probably developing it for being, you know, a little portable computer, an ARM processed computer or whatever it is. I'm sure I'm going to get absolutely murdered in the comments section by hardware and software experts, because While I do have a passing understanding of all this works, I'm sure it's more nuanced beyond my level of expertise. But let's begin by going over what is a field programmable gate array. Basically, these are little customizable circuits, and the real feature of them is that you're able to get them to behave and act like other circuits. So with software-based emulation, you usually write code, right? And the software emulates the behavior of the hardware. This is something we see in MAME, something we see in typical PC emulators. But with FPGA and with the MiSTer, what it's doing is it's having hardware, these little circuits, copying the behavior of other hardware. So it's kind of like a clone console, if y'all remember those, like the infamous Chinese Super Nintendo clone consoles, where they would take chips that weren't official chips and make them sort of act like the Super Nintendo chips. It's like that, but it's much more malleable and it can change on the fly. So for 1 minute, it can be acting like a Super Nintendo, and then you load up the next core, and now those circuits change their configuration, and now it's acting like a Neo Geo. And then you load up the next core, the circuits change their configuration, and now it's acting like a Sega Genesis. So it's really cool how it's able to move from system to system, from configuration to configuration. And this is the massive advantage of the MiSTer. What makes it, I think, a real prospect for the future, because when it comes to playing games on original hardware, I think there's a real appeal to that that's kind of hard to necessarily explain. And I think a lot of people do struggle to explain this, because I think some people just chalk it up to pure nostalgia. And maybe that is that way for some people, where they think about, oh, I take the cartridge out and it smells like my childhood, and I put it in the slot and it doesn't boot right away, so I have to take it out and blow it, but apparently you're not supposed to do that. But it just reminds me of being a kid on Saturday morning, so I do it anyway, and I plug it back in, and that's the magic of playing on original hardware. And I think that is that way for some people, but for me personally, the real appeal of original hardware, which isn't necessarily connected to nostalgia, because I never stopped playing my Super Nintendo, so while it does kind of remind me of my childhood, it also reminds me of my teen years, my college years, and last year. Like, I never put my Super Nintendo away, so the nostalgia isn't quite there for me. But the thing about the original hardware aspect and the FPGA aspect and the circuitry aspect is I really like the idea of interacting with the physical hardware, the electricity running through the visceral physicality of it. Same reason why I like CRTs, the idea of the light being projected onto the screen, and there's a real physical sort of element to it. That's the real appeal to me. And also, I think, theoretical level, and I'm sure I'm going to get absolutely roasted in the comments, because apparently this is sort of a controversial topic, is some people say it can end up being much more accurate than software-based emulation, because, the physical process is much closer to the original experience. Then I've heard other people saying that FPGA can't get everything 100% correct, and maybe on a giant, multi-core computer, you can actually get real close with the software-based emulation. So I've heard both sides of the argument. I think it's probably somewhere in the middle there, where depending on the quality of the core and the quality of the emulation, it probably ends up being fairly negligible either way. But in my case, I think just the visceral experience of playing something that's so close on an electronic level is really cool. And also, it seems like a much more viable alternative to these systems moving into the future, because what I think is happening that's very interesting was a few years back, a lot of people were hardware purists, and they kind of really stuck by their guns there, where they were saying, I only play on the original hardware. I don't play on emulators. I don't play on all these clone console crap. I play on the real deal, and I will always only play on the original hardware. And I think a few years ago, that was a much more common perspective. But I think that perspective is starting to wane away more and more, because people are sort of fudging this. Especially, I think My Life in Gaming really fudged this a lot. And it was kind of funny to see the evolution of their channel, where the beginning of the channel, they were much more in that ethos. Then as their channel moves along, like, they're slowly like creeping more into sort of my territory of emulation and stuff. And they're like, how did we get here? I think that's kind of just the natural progression, because as you start wanting more features, you start adding more modifications, and then those build on each other, and then they keep building on each other. Before you know it, you're looking at a console and you're like, is this an original console anymore? I think the Nintendo is a great example of this, or the Super Nintendo, where you start off like, S-Video's quality of picture isn't all that great, so let me do a little RGB mod, and so now it can output RGB video and have much cleaner video. And you're like, okay. Then you're like, well, maybe it's kind of a pain in the butt to constantly be switching out the cartridges all the time. Maybe it would be a little bit more convenient to put like an EverDrive in there, and then I could like play my cartridges on an SD card, but they're still my cartridges, but I could play it, without having to get up and swap out the cartridges all the time. You're like, okay. And then you might take it a step further. Well, it's like, well, wouldn't it be nice if I had an EverDrive that also did save states and was able to play things that you couldn't actually play on the original hardware? And so that's kind of the evolution this has been going over the years, and it's kind of funny to see. I've seen it with the N64, with the Super Nintendo, with the Nintendo, and then they start going, well, maybe we should just start playing on the Analogue NT. And so people who began life saying, I will never play on anything other than the original hardware, over time end up playing on an FPGA system, just because it starts to incorporate all these features and they sort of compound on each other. And I honestly think this is a natural progression, and I've gone through this progression as well. And I think that was the big appeal to the MiSTer, to where it kind of harkens back to what you're looking for with the original hardware, but it's adding so many quality of life features on top of it that it's really hard to deny how great it is. For example, if you're wanting to capture your gameplay, right? You have to do all these modifications to get it into RGB. Then you got to run it through an OSSC and all that sort of stuff. But what if you want to play on a CRT while also capturing? Well, then you got to get even more complicated here. Whereas the MiSTer, this bad boy, if you get the IO board, it can just output onto your CRT, output HDMI. You don't need to do all this kind of extra steps in between. And so I think that's kind of been the evolution, and I think it's going to continue on that way. The sort of retro gaming bubble is starting to burst. People are kind of getting bored of it, at least from what I'm witnessing. I don't think collecting is as hot as it used to be. I'm hearing more and more people saying, oh yeah, it was fun to get out 8 different consoles and have them all in my living room, and getting up and switching SCART cables. And again, this is something where you need to buy SCART switchers, and then you need to buy all these special cables and all that sort of thing. And then at the end of the day, you're like, well, wouldn't it be nice if I could just make a little bit of space and put a MiSTer there and just load up a different core? And then also, maybe I don't want to play the Super Nintendo with a Super Nintendo pad. Maybe I want to play it with a 6-button Genesis pad. So then they find all these different converters to get that to work. Or maybe I want to play the Sega Genesis with a Sega Saturn pad. And then you look at the MiSTer, you can basically throw any pad you want at that thing, it'll run it. If you're like myself, where I play everything on arcade stick, it doesn't matter anyway. For example, my story is I was going through and modding every single system to support my arcade stick. I was like making special mods to run an arcade stick on my Super Nintendo. I was modding my Sega Genesis to run an arcade stick, which is a huge pain in the ass. I was modding my Sega Saturn. You still have to do that because the Saturn isn't supported, but you know what I'm getting at. Kind of sitting around like, man, wouldn't it be cool if you could play the Game Boy with an arcade stick? And so you had to load it on a Super Game Boy on a Super Nintendo, right? Like, so many of these things, we were finding all these sort of workarounds over and over and over, and just trying to push the hardware beyond what it could do, to the point you need to kind of sit down and ask yourself, is this original hardware ethos that I was sticking by, is this really all that it was cracked up to be? Maybe it is worthwhile to start looking into innovations, and maybe that's just my perspective, and that might be a little bit controversial, but I think people interested in the MiSTer are starting to go that direction. And also, we have to be realistic about moving into the future. These things aren't going to be around forever, especially arcade stuff. I mean, the MiSTer's potential when it comes to arcade and Neo Geo is absolutely ridiculous, because for years I wanted a Neo Geo. Of course, you could emulate Neo Geos very easily. Final Burn Neo, Final Burn Alpha have always been great emulators for the Neo Geo. MAME's always been really solid for it. But there was a real appeal of having a Neo Geo for me, because, like I said, the whole like hardware side of things, I really, really wanted one. But because of the price, either MVS, conversions, or getting a hold of AES cartridges, or just sheer difficulty of getting that all put together and gathered, it never quite clicked for me, and I never quite went ahead and pulled the trigger on buying one. And then there was issues like, well, what if I wanted to overclock it? You know, what if I wanted to do all these modifications on it? That would probably be a little bit outside the realm of what would be possible. So I always kind of turned back to software emulation for this type of thing. But now with the MiSTer, if I want to play Neo Geo games, I have the MiSTer to do that, and it kind of satisfied that craving for the original hardware. This recording studio, or whatever you want to call it, used to have a ton of stuff in here, to the point where I couldn't keep it all, right? I'd have to like move it around and stuff. But now I put my Super Nintendo away, I put my Genesis away, put all that sort of stuff away, because the MiSTer just does it, and it does what I want to do. And I think that is a huge appeal of the MiSTer, and I think it's going to be the main driving force. Another really cool appeal about it is it's much more universal across things than something like software-based emulation. Having worked on Shmup Arch, I'm really familiar with this, where based on the PC you're running, people can have very different experiences, what operating system you're on. Oh, I'm on Linux. Oh, I'm on Mac or whatever, Apple operating system. Oh, I'm on Windows. I'm on Windows 7. I'm on Windows 10. I'm on Windows 8. Oh, there was a software update. Now there's more lag. Or how much frame delay can your system run? What graphics card do you use? How much run ahead can you handle? That's a thing that's always been really difficult about software-based emulation, is just the variation in people's hardware is a real issue. Whereas with the MiSTer, everyone's pretty much using the same stuff. You can have little upgrades to it, like you can get a RAM board, you can get the IO board, but the base model is going to be really similar and going to be really consistent. So I could see it really catching on in the future with stuff like speedrunning, to where they could just easily standardize it and everyone's using the same thing. That's also been kind of an issue too when you get into the CD-based games. So this can run some CD-based stuff. But what's been really interesting in the world of speedrunning is they've been really struggling with CD-based consoles like the PlayStation, to where how do you get consistent load times between people? Maybe one PlayStation loads a little bit faster than the other, how CDs are and all that sort of thing. And so as this thing advances and starts to be able to maybe cover those CD-based consoles, I could see it being absolutely a huge benefit for people that are using it for speedrunning and that sort of thing, because it's going to be way more consistent and you're not going to have that variation in hardware. I'm not sure with software-based emulators if you could also standardize that, or if there's like microseconds differences between people's load times on software or not. I really don't know, but I can just see a lot of uses for this thing. And it seems to have much more of a cultural acceptability among people for some reason, as opposed to software-based emulation. For example, I don't think you could really get away with emulating stuff and using it at GDQ. They don't really allow for that sort of thing. But I could see a future where they would allow you to run stuff off a MiSTer, put your game cartridge on top of the MiSTer and play it. I don't know, just to prove you own the game or something. I could see it happening for some reason. It just seems to appeal to that demographic much more. And you could, I guess, make little add-ons that could, like the Super Antique does this, right? Where you could plug in your cartridge and it could run your cartridge. The other thing about the MiSTer that I want to really explain about before I start talking about its disadvantages that's really, really cool, is just how versatile this thing is and what it is capable of doing, to where you can basically throw it at any setup and it's gonna deliver. And that's not really something anything else out there is capable of. Maybe the Pi to some degree, but basically it or the Pi, to where you can run this thing on a CRT. You could run this in 240p, you could run it in 480p, you could run it in 480i, you could upscale it to like a really high definition CRT. You could also run it on an HDMI output. You can run it at 60 FPS. It supports FreeSync apparently, which is absolutely insane. It just can do everything everywhere, and that versatility is a real appeal to me. Another feature that I also really like about it, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that it can output to analog and digital at the same time. So you can play a game on your CRT, you can play Super Mario Bros. 3 Speedrun or something on your CRT, and you could capture it via HDMI without having to go through all these extra steps. But that's a huge problem for me. For example, with my arcade hardware, for something like the PGM, while it is really cool, the PGM, getting that onto an analog display while also capturing it is an absolute pain in the ass. And a lot of people have struggled this too that play on arcade hardware. So for instance, let's say you play an arcade game like Dodonpachi and you played on a cabinet. In the past, capturing Dodonpachi gameplay from a cabinet is very difficult and expensive and complicated, because you have to split the system and upscale, blah, 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 blah. But with something like the MiSTer, what you could do is you could set this in your cabinet and then just run an HDMI cord to a capture card and then just capture it too. I mean, there's so many real uses that you can have for this thing, and it's just so versatile. That's where I think the MiSTer really excels. But as far as the disadvantages, the main disadvantage of the MiSTer is the homebrew aspect of it, to where you're gonna have to get your hands down and dirty. Setting it up is really kind of a pain in the butt. It's not that hard, but it's kind of a pain, and it's not something I look forward to doing over and over again. And if you want to get something to work, sometimes you have to get in there and play around with the INI file. Just having a certain familiarity with this sort of stuff really takes you a long way and really helps you out. So there is a learning curve to this thing, and I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle for it. Also, another big hurdle for it is it's not going to quite appeal to people who want to use their original cartridges still, and it doesn't look like this thing is going to be able to do that for a very long time. Not without some kind of significant redesign, I don't think. So if you're wanting to play your original cartridges and that's like a big deal to you, then you probably still would end up using something like a Super NT or the Analogue system where they have the cartridge slots and all that sort of thing. The real thing though you have to question is if you end up getting a Super NT and then you just put an EverDrive in there, it's like, okay, why not just get a MiSTer and stick the SD card directly in the MiSTer and also have access to all these other cores and systems? But again, you know, whatever people prefer, it's not a big deal to me. The analog systems do seem to be pretty cool. What ended up turning me off from those though was their lack of versatility with their video output. Where I remember the Super NT came out, there was a ton of hype for it and I was gonna get it. It didn't have analog output. And so I was sitting there thinking like, well, that's kind of half of the appeal of these things, is to be able to play them on your original CRTs and stuff, right? Like that's kind of the point of it, isn't it? And so the fact that it didn't have analog output out the gate was the reason I didn't buy it. And then they introduced the DAC or whatever to where you could have analog output. But for me, it was really expensive for one. It's also kind of, the original system I felt was overpriced, and pricing wise the MiSTer is, I think, much more affordable than those other ones per value anyway. I think baseline price is similar, but on those you're getting one system. On the MiSTer you're getting all these other things and you can upgrade it to run Neo Geo and all this other stuff. So the open source aspect of it I think really balances it out there. But anyway, this is kind of my overall thoughts on the MiSTer. I think it is absolutely worth it. The advantages of it again are that it's able to play games on a hardware based level. It can pretty accurately simulate what's going on your original hardware, to the point where I feel comfortable just putting my original hardware away, letting it retire in peace, in safety, I suppose. I'm not going to sell it, but I'm not going to keep it out. It's just much more convenient to have this little guy hanging around. I think it's actually kind of cool looking too, especially when you get the IO board on there and it's got the lights. It kind of looks like a little arcade PCB or something like that. It's also, moving forward, it's going to be really cool to see what it does with arcade. That's the main draw to me, where, you know, the Dodonpachi core, of course, but also just emulating other arcade stuff. I think there's a whole aspect there that's really underexplored and really underdeveloped. And I would love to see how far they could take the MiSTer. Like if they could start getting it to emulate the later Cave titles that MAME seems to struggle with, right? Like the Mushis and the Ibaras and that sort of thing. That would be really cool. I don't know if that's on the horizon anytime soon, but getting it already done with the Dodonpachi and the other games associated on that board is going to be really, really awesome. And it really is the best way to play Dodonpachi on some sort of hardware-based solution, other than buying the expensive PCB, of course. Because when you're playing it on like the Saturn or you're playing it on the PlayStation 1, those ports are just absolutely awful. The chaining is straight up busted. The chaining doesn't even work, and the frame rate's too fast and the slowdown's missing. I mean, it's just a nightmare to play on those. So yeah, keep your eye out on the MiSTer. Even if you're not willing to pick it up yet, I think it's just going to keep improving and improving to the point where it's going to be pretty undeniable for the enthusiasts to pick it up, especially if you're into analog displays and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I hope this was somewhat helpful in understanding the appeal of the MiSTer and why I think it is a very solid product. I've had it for 6 months now, so I have definitely put the time in. It wasn't a thing where I got it last week and I'm reviewing it this week. No, I've definitely tried it out and made sure it's up to standard here. So I want to end this by thanking my patrons, and thanks so much everyone who's joined the Patreon. I really appreciate it a lot. The Patreon really goes a long way to supporting the channel. I do have to say that because I think I need to promote the Patreon a little bit more in my videos because I kind of forget to at times. But thank you so much to Adam Pearson, Adrian Reyes, Dingo, Andy Cap, Anthony A, Ben Wynn, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Corio, Disco Star Slayer, Dominic NG, Eric H, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Hausu, Ilya, Kiwi, JLab, JB RPG, Joe Angelo, Gameboy Guru, K, Malays, Mark Toms, Maz, Meher Calendrian, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron 9, Okla Kugels, Philip Mason, Portal 63, Ram Q, Raul, Real Skeen, Sketchy Raccoon, Smacky Factor, TRM, Sugumo, Plasmo, Yishi, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.